Okay, our next presenter is Hans van Tilburg, who has worked as a carpenter, a sports diving instructor, commercial diver, and science diver in California, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Wisconsin. He earned a BA in Geography from UC Berkeley, an MA in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University, and a PhD in History from the University of Hawaii, where he also ran the graduate program in Maritime Archaeology and History under the Marine Option Program. Hans has taught numerous university courses in world history and maritime history. He has published over 30 articles and book reviews, as well as several books. He has served as a consultant for UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, as well as been a co-instructor for Underwater Cultural Heritage Foundation courses in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean. He is currently the Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the Maritime Heritage Program in the Pacific Islands region, and the Unit Diving Supervisor for NOAA's National Ocean Service in Hawaii. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's really been an interesting day for me to hear these fantastic presentations, and I look forward to tomorrow. I'll offer my apology and caveat now. This is going to be a very informal presentation. I just felt like, what I had to offer was just some thoughts and questions and look at some assumptions on potential maritime cultural landscapes in Hawaii. We don't actually have any nominated shipwreck sites in Hawaii, with the exception of the Arizona and the Utah inside Pearl Harbor as part of that park, which is now called Valor in the Pacific National Monument. It's not that, cultural resources are not important in the islands. It's exactly the opposite. They've been so important that the topic of shipwrecks is simply the new resource at the table, because those are properties. And Hawaii has not been focused on properties. They've been focused on relationships and cultural landscapes, relationships to marine areas, and use of resources. But it's a very interesting environment in which to work. This is timely for me as well and for folks in Hawaii because of course, we have the National Marine Monument, Papahanaumokuakea. There'll be a test on how to pronounce that at the end of this talk. That's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a mixed site, cultural and natural resources, but submerged maritime elements were not part of that nomination. And then we have a sanctuary in the main Hawaiian Islands, the Humpback Whale Sanctuary, which, unlike the rest of our sites, is a single species sanctuary right now and does not directly manage or engage cultural properties per se. Now that site is in transition and review to expand its mandate, become ecosystem-based, include properties and cultural resources, shipwrecks, etc. That review's in process, and it's a very interesting process. But what I want to emphasize throughout this talk is the multicultural and multi-layered nature of elements for landscapes in the islands. And here, if you can make out the different colors on the map, it's simply an overlay of waves of history. In this case, one being the Pacific voyaging migration eastwards into the Pacific, the Lapita culture migration, eventually achieving the discovery of Hawaii. Another one being maybe whaling exploits, historic whaling beginning in the 19th century, and whaling areas, and the third being activities in World War II, the bulk of the activities, many of the battles. And there are overlays that wrap around each other and sometimes are related to each other. So it's a complicated area. There's no one single maritime cultural landscape. There are multiple landscapes to talk about. I'll mention the whaling landscape, though, the potential for one, because this is something for us that's very important for our system, because most, if not all, of our sanctuary sites include historic whaling elements. And so discussing a landscape like this can unite and does unite our efforts in various ways, and in fact ways beyond individual sanctuaries. We've been doing work in Alaska, but certainly in the East Coast, and then for West Coast sanctuaries, and out in Hawaii, historic whaling period. We have 10 recorded whalers lost in the National Monument, Marine National Monument, 5 of which have been discovered. And I thought, well, that's obviously a maritime cultural landscape. And then I thought, is it a whaling landscape? Now, I believe it is, But I think it's important for someone to ask the question, because they're not actually whaling in those atolls. They're transiting to whaling areas. And there are about 50 or 60 other shipwrecks in the monument. So they're a vessel that wrecks. It's a shipwreck cultural landscape. Is it a whaling landscape? We claim it is, but someone could probably look at that assumption. Whaling as a theme, as an importance for a landscape analysis, of course, is, I think, fairly obvious. Huge impacts for the Pacific and Hawaii. You know, sailing in the wake of old Captain Cook, trickles of vessels came in, a few, maybe one or two a year. When the whalers started coming out in 1819 to the Hawaiian Islands then, it quickly ran right up to, in the mid-19th century, 600 or 700 whalers a year. To call them cultural ambassadors would be nice. Probably not our best example. But the impact on the islands, socially, economically, in every way, is quite significant as a transshipment port. Now, there were shore whaling stations that were established, a handful of them. We don't have the remains of those. They haven't been identified on land yet, but a number of whalers were lost in the main islands and up in the northwesterns. And the elements of whaling resources then include those shipwrecks, include whaling museums, include the archival materials, a number of other things that can be included in a landscape or go beyond landscape. One of the most significant impacts of those whalers was for the local population, of course. The number of Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders that were involved in the American whaling industry is staggering. At times, 1/5 of the entire fleet, Pacific Islanders and Hawaiian whalers. When the fleets were crushed up there in the Chukchi Sea, about half of the survivors of that 1871 incident that crushed about 33 vessels in the ice were Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians, and no one lost a life with that incident. Significant impact. Obvious one for cultural landscape, whaling cultural landscape, but these are a little small, but these maps simply show, the one on the left, the fact that the located populations of whales didn't include the islands of Hawaii. They're south of the groups where they were looking. So it's transshipment, rest and recreation port. They're going to the whaling grounds, for instance, in the lower right map. The Japan grounds are off the Japan grounds, further to the west of Midway and Kure. That's the business end of whaling. That's the significant areas the whalers would have identified, and there's nothing there. Say nothing there. It's not a bounded area. It wouldn't be included as a cultural landscape element. So I have interesting questions about that, but I think it's clear that we'll continue with the look at the whaling landscape in many ways. Marine transportation would be another obvious one, especially for the islands, and especially with the advent of harbors. Now here's another example of interaction between environment and cultural practice and effect to the environment, cultural footprint. I'm reminded of Honolulu itself, Honolulu Harbor. That's not where the ships began to come in. They were in a roadstead off of Waikiki. But the freshwater stream from Nu'uanu that ran down to the shore prevented the coral growing in one area, which led to kind of a natural alcove underwater. And the whalers and the ships started going over there, and so all the merchants shifted over to what is now Honolulu Harbor, established the whole city out of that natural footprint. This is an important one for us as well because we're engaged in an island-wide inventory as part of our BOEM-funded project, Maritime Resource Studies in preparation for understanding the impacts of offshore energy development, as Dave Ball will talk about. And we get accumulations of shipwrecks around these harbors. It's not a random distribution at all. So the harbors themselves, besides the hundreds of shipwrecks that have been reported in Hawaii, the many that have been found, although we have a very high energy environment, would be elements of a transportation maritime cultural landscape. Here's an image of one, the traditional harbor up in Mahukona on the Big Island, once the formal entry point for the Kingdom of Hawaii, and then a number of resources left there. What are we talking about? Mooring systems, wharves, piers, landings, anchorages, anchors, chains, all kinds of implements dropped over the side, in addition to the harbor itself. This is the conjunction point or transit node of the railways. And if you think back on your history with folks like Eisenberg, Kingdom, Brunel, he kind of saw those steamship lines as simply an extension of a railway, although you could think of it in the other way as well. This raises the question for me of, how much are we going to nominate as a maritime cultural landscape or an element? We have ships bringing railway equipment and cargo in. We have the rail ties and we have wheels on the bottom of the harbor. Then we have the rails leading right down to the harbor, and then the elements of the railways themselves. I'm not sure what the answer is to that one. It's a pattern distribution if you look at the distribution of shipwrecks, not a random one, and these give you an idea of where the plantation landings were servicing all of those steamship vessels, beginning in the 1850s, 1860s. So you get an idea of the landscape, the altered landscape for many of these landings. There are only a couple really safe harbors. It's a very high energy environment, right? Many others are actually wire rope landings. So a landing would be simply, anchors, mooring systems on the bottom of the little bay. We don't call them dog hole ports there, and then fixed infrastructure in the cliffs. And they would run a wire hawser down over the mooring area. The vessel would come in, they'd run the cargo down the wire, and drop it right down into the hold. Wire rope landings, very rough. Treacherous. Vessels had to come in close to the cliffs. So if you look at an older map, for instance, there are more sites we know of now, but where the known shipwreck sites are, remember this is a little bit misleading because there's been no comprehensive directed survey for all of these underwater cultural resources. It's simply the ones we know about. And you flip back and forth between where the landings are, you begin to see patterns of distribution in the landscape for predicting and modeling wreck sites. And here also you see the outlines in lighter blue of the humpback whale sanctuary itself. If you want to be more specific, if you want to change the scale of a landscape discussion, you can look at the steamship landings. Because it'd be a subset, obviously, of marine transportation. Why would you do that, though? Why would you change the scale? There's all kinds of marine transportation going on. It's a fairly broad category. But the steamship landings are tied to the plantation era. And the plantation era shapes the demography and social and economic and political realities of Hawaii for a long, long time. So it's not until you have a reason, the treaty in 1870 to ship the agricultural products to the mainland, that you then have the boom in plantations, which then support economically the steamships, small mosquito fleet coming out to the islands. And plantation heritage is a recognizable resource heritage on shore. So we have a number of these steamship wreck sites. And the heavier material, of course, stands up very well underwater and are in an energy environment. The lighter stuff, the wood, simply all gone. There's a specific area on one island, Lanai Island, which is the disposal site for many of those steamships. So now we're talking about an abandoned ship abandonment paradigm, a subset of another cultural landscape. Shipwreck Beach on Lanai, where dozens of these vessels were run up onto the beach. Where is the intersection between, the question was earlier, the intersection between environmental feature and wreck sites? This is one of them. It's a ship trap. Due to the configuration of the islands, due to the prevailing trade winds, the fact of these reefs, and due to the private nature of Lanai Island, it was Dole Plantation. Nobody was going to complain when those ship owners took their vessels over there and abandoned them on the reef and let them drift right up. We get dozens of wreck sites there that can be useful for finding survey sites for the annual Maritime survey class. So there are a couple different ways to go with the marine transportation. I think a couple of different scales you can discuss. It's interesting to decide, which one you want to focus on. I'm glad to see the image of surf sites that came up earlier today, because this is something that's, of course, a huge matter in Hawaii. Not a shipwreck site, not a property site, But if we're talking about the connection between heritage and traditional practice and modern practice and environment, surf sites are specific to bottom topography and prevailing swells, et cetera, et cetera. And this image shows you named surf sites along one portion of Oahu's south shore. Surfing, of course, is a heritage activity that goes back to the pre-Western contact days. Obviously, I think the Hawaiians had 6 different types of traditional surfing, and some interesting books have been written recently about the heritage of surfing. My talk today is on historic types or potentials for landscape. Tomorrow we'll hear from Kahau Watson on the native Hawaiian multicultural landscapes perspectives. So we broke it up a little bit to have one talk today, one talk tomorrow. This was traditional practice, which has become now such a modern competitive sport that in this way we begin to lose sight of the heritage cultural landscape. Time? Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry. The military landscape is the most important one in Hawaii, and I can't overstress this enough. Is the one I wanted to get to is there's no other example of such potential to talk about than all of these military sites in Hawaii. These are air bases across the islands. These are the coastal defense structures simply on Oahu Island that play a big role in heritage interpretation. Pillboxes used onshore, remnants of pillboxes used underwater now for artificial barriers. There's a picture of an airfield, lots of airfields. There's some 80-plus U.S. Navy ships and submarines in the waters around the islands, and over 1,400 naval aircraft. Large-scale exercises done in the past, leaving the traces on the bottom of landing craft and aircraft exercise areas. Not combat, not battles, but losses during massive exercises, amphibious training. The questions I have about that kind of military landscape are many, but one is simply of scale. Where do you stop? The reason I show you this image is because you can't understand the landscape of military activities and resources in Hawaii today, why the military does what it does, unless you realize that half of the world is controlled from Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet goes right into the Indian Ocean. And so we have to have some kind of artificial limitation, 50-year, 100-year, landscape of this size, landscape of that size. But to understand those landscapes and elements, there's a question of scale that I'm interested in and don't have the answer for myself. Finally, I would simply say that for the reason for looking at the whaling, transportation, surfing, or even these military landscapes, for me, becomes more one of engaging the public in something that they'll understand as relevance, greater relevance. Unexploded ordnance is my best example of that. We're talking about the paradigm, the assumption, and a good assumption that this effort in cultural landscapes is done to protect and preserve properties. That's a good one. But it can't be just an assumption. It has to be an intentional decision. Because we're a preservation program in a marine resource agency. And so we've talked about underwater ordnance, unexploded ordnance. Where is our responsibility for adding those to our landscape studies? And that ordnance would not be part of an outstanding universal value or something like that in a preservation objective landscape. But it's a huge topic for Hawaii. So I have questions about those objectives and those goals. Thank you very much.